I am finally ready to get back to working on the half bug motor. It's been 2 months since I've touched it because I've been working on the Corvette, but Corvette's done, so we can get back to that. One of the last things I did was build the seal retainer for the front, clearanced everything for the crank. I just now cleaned up the oil pump. It was covered in, guess what? Permatex. So now I need to put the studs in the case, put all the oil fittings in. But first, I've been grinding on it. We need to take it to the car wash and blast it all out. Give it one final cleaning before we put the case together. Well, I think I've got these about as clean as I'm going to get them. Took them to the car wash, blasted them out with degreaser, then brought them home, hit them with tons of compressed air, solvent through all the passages. So I'm going to start putting stuff back in for good. First thing I'm going to put in is this big plug right here out of the front. We'll put some sealant on it, get that screwed in there. Since this is not a tapered plug, it's just straight threads, I'm using anaerobic sealer on it. Should set up nicely between the threads. So I'll screw that back in there to where it was originally because it had a stake mark. And if it ever ends up leaking, I'll take it back out and try something else. I think that'll hold okay. Next up, we have the little oil holes back here that I tapped to 1/4-20. So we use a couple of set screws in them, blue Loctite. They won't be able to come out because the cover will be on the back case, but just to make sure they don't move around. Now I'll screw these in until they're just below the surface of the back of the case. You don't want them sticking up, interfering with the cover going on, but you don't need them any further down in there either. Now we got one of the main oil passages here that needs plugged up. Now it's going to get filled up with this special pipe plug that I cut down just for that, so it'll stay below the surface of the back. And there it is, right below the surface of the back of the case. Next up, 2 holes on the front here that goes the oil galleys. They had press-in plugs, took those out, threaded them, put some pipe plugs in. Using Loctite to seal them in there. That should hopefully block any oil. They're a pipe plug anyway, so they seal halfway decent. And I don't want to just absolutely crank them in there because of the possibility, since they're tapered plugs, of popping this case. At this point, I don't want to do any more welding on the case. The hole right here at the top, I think it was supposed to be plugged. If not, I'll take it back out later. It's been too long since I've worked on this thing. I know this one is for your oil pressure. So yeah, that one should be plugged. Top 2 holes there have been threaded, but they are for the oil cooler. And they will have these fittings in there with adapters. I'm not going to put those in right now. No reason to, and I'll get them angled exactly right when I've got the oil cooler built. That's just a little threaded hole. That, of course, is where the crankcase vent will go eventually. That's in. That is a blind hole there, so no reason to plug it. I didn't take that one out. Everything's on the back that I can think of. So I think that's got all the oil holes plugged. All right, we need to put the oil pressure relief valve back in. There's the old stuff. Here's the new kit, and it had stuff for the dual relief. So basically just need to pick out one set of stuff. Long spring. These valves, I looked at them, they're the same. So one valve. We'll stick the rest of that stuff in a bag. Maybe use it some other time. Pressure relief valve goes in this hole right here. If you watch the other video, we drilled an extra hole up there since we're converting this from a dual to single relief. So that will maintain a certain amount of oil pressure. Can't remember what it said it maintained, but it will maintain, it's supposed to maintain a certain level according to the plans. Bore is nice and clean. Run some assembly lube down the side. Lube up the piston. Drop it in there. Well, look at that. Smoothly went all the way to the bottom. See right in there, it covered up the new hole that I drilled. So once it gets to a certain amount of oil pressure, it'll push it down past that hole and leak some oil back in the case, maintaining a certain amount of oil pressure. Lube the spring up a little bit, just make sure it doesn't rust or anything. Set it down in there. And that is in there. You can see the piston in the left hole and the spring down in the right hole. And the bottom hole there with the spring is not any kind of relief for the oil as far as pressure. It just lets whatever flows past that piston have some place to go. Otherwise it would fill up that chamber and hydro-lock that piston in place. So it just lets the oil lube the spring and then go back into the case. And that hole right there on the left was not in this case originally, since it was the dual relief. The actual oil pressure relief was at the end of the circuit in the back half of the case, which we cut off. So that's why we had to drill that hole. And that hole is basically makes this like a earlier model single relief case. Right now I'm getting ready to put the prop hub on here. So you've got to make sure all of this stuff is in place, along with having my seal retainer on there before you press the prop hub on, because once that's on there, everything is fixed in place. The thing you want to need to make sure you've got right is your orientation of your alignment pin and the oil hole on this bearing here. Because when it comes off, you've got to make sure that the pin and the oil hole there on the bottom are lined up. You don't want to have it 180 out, because that will totally block your oil feed. And I'm thinking you could probably get that in there backwards and get the case bolted together. I want to make sure it's like this with the oil hole down and kept in the correct orientation on the crank. Because when the crank goes on there, it'll come up, turn like this. So everything will be lined up. So now I've set my seal retainer on there because it will slide up and onto the hub when the hub is on there. So it's just sitting there like that. Got the keyway in. So now we should be able to put the hub on. It was my understanding that the hub is it's obviously a interference fit on the front here because it's not tapered or anything. That it was a heat it and slip it on their hub. So I'm going to try heating it. If it doesn't fit on there, then I'll finish pressing it on. Okay, I'm going to heat this up to about 500 degrees, which is about where we would heat it up if it was, say, a end of a connecting rod to install a piston pin. That was about 300 degrees right there. And there it went. I was originally going for a higher temp, but 300 degrees, it dropped right on there. So if you've got a digital thermometer, that would be what I would shoot for. 300 degrees, it's set right on there. It's already cooled down enough. It's seized onto the shaft, so should be good. I used a lot of compressed air because I didn't want to get my seal overheated since it's in the area. But man, that went on there slick. The highest reading I saw with a digital thermometer was 300 degrees, and boom, just dropped on there. So easy to install. Okay, now that the prop hub's installed, we need to install the connecting rods. And these things go on in a certain way, of course. Your front cylinder goes out this way looking at the engine. Back one goes out this way. So when you put the rods on, see that casting mark there? Each rod's got that. That needs to go up. So that one will go like that. And the back one will go like that. All right, now I want to check the gap. These are standard rods, standard crank. I'm going to put the bearings in, which Castler sent the silver line bearings. Double check to make sure they're standard size. I'm going to stick them on there. Torque this down with some plastic gauge in it to double check the gap. This will be a little difficult because you cannot move the rod with the plastic gauge in there. It'll smear it. So I'm going to have to get everything fastened in place enough that I can torque it down and then take it back loose without turning it. Okay, this is standard engine building stuff, but you want to make sure to keep the cap and the rod oriented the same. See, these have got numbers on one side. It's been double dotted on the other, so just make sure they're kept in the same orientation. I'm going to clean off the surfaces here, slip the bearings in. Got a block sitting here. I've got the crank propped up, so we should be able to slide that together with a piece of plastic gauge in there, torque it down, and get a good reading. Hopefully. Okay, the notches on the bearing go on the notches. I'm going to put a little bit of trans gel on there, which is a real sticky assembly grease, because the way we got to do this, that'll end up falling out of there otherwise. You put that plastic gauge crossways across the bearing. Orient this the right direction. Put everything together dry, except for that little dab of grease. Orient this correctly. Slide it up in there. Go ahead and put the nuts on. Now, proper torque on these is 23 foot-pounds. It is important to torque them properly because that's what compresses that plastic gauge. Now, carefully undo them. And I think we got a good reading. Can you see that pressed section in the middle? That's the plastic gauge. And now you use this little chart that the plastic gauge comes in, and you compare the width of that part that's squeezed to what it shows on there, and we're wanting that. And we're wanting the green one marked about 2/1000 of an inch. She is right in between 1.5 and 2/1000 of an inch, so that is spot on. So now all we need to do is clean the plastic gauge off. Usually scrape it off with your fingernail, then a little bit of solvent, because you don't want any of that left in there. And then this rod can be installed for good. I'll do the same on the other one, double check it. Once I've verified it, then we'll go ahead and put the rods on. Okay, I went to go to check the second rod, and it's not marked. Doesn't have the numbers, doesn't have any existing punch marks. But the way you can also tell, I could put some marks on it. And if I had more than one rod or something and there was any chance of getting them mixed up, I would do something like that. But you have the slot here for the notches on your bearings. They go together. So you would not want to turn it around whether the notches are on opposite side. Keep the notches together. Side 2 checked out just perfect. Well, now we're ready to install for good. Same as before, except we don't have to be as careful about turning the crank. Now I'm going to put some assembly lube down in the oil hole. And we'll coat the bearing surfaces here. As always, make sure everything's clean. I've been blowing stuff off with compressed air. Put some lube here. Make sure all that plastic gauge stuff is cleaned up. This is the front one. Notch goes up. Match your numbers, punch marks on that. Slide that in. Slide that in. Thing turns smooth. Torque them down just like you did on the test bed. Turns nice and free. Did the same thing on the back cylinder. So now we're another step closer. Got the rods in now. So I need to do a little more work on the case. Should be able to set that in there.